thank you for everyone that's joining us today, and a special thank you to Rand Abdul Jabbar, who is joining us today on our 8th talk. And for those that are joining us for the first time, I'm Sarah Al-Meheri, and I'm an artist based in Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates. And it's been a while since I've mentioned why I decided to create this series. I mentioned it maybe in the first or second talk, but I just want to bring it back and say that at the beginning of the quarantine, it was an attempt to engage with the local art community and those that are also based abroad but showcased regularly here, and to provide a forum to initiate conversation and share our practices and processes as visual artists. And these sessions are also recorded, so you can go back to them anytime on YouTube. And with that, I hope that the conversations also continue beyond these talks as well. And I'd also like to announce that there's no talk next week, but the next one that we will have will be on July 13th. So moving on to today's talk, we have Rand Abdul Jabbar, as I mentioned before, and she's going to start off by talking about a few projects that span from the years 2016 to about this year, 2020. And following that will be a small segment. We'll reveal what that is later on. And then we'll also have a Q&A session. So if you have any comments or any questions, just send it through the chat box. And if you'd like to ask the question yourself, there will be time where you can unmute and ask the question to Rand or me herself. Okay, okay. And just to give a bit of background about our guest today, Rand was born in Baghdad in Iraq in 1990. She engages in a multidisciplinary approach to creative output, oscillating across the threshold between design, architecture, and the visual arts. Her current research pursues examining ancient Mesopotamian culture, drawing inspiration from its architecture, archaeology, and mythology. Simultaneously, through an engagement with constructed and inherited archives and narratives of a modern-day Iraq, she examines the tension between the tangible and the ephemeral within her own personal family history, contesting with and staking claim to a world beyond her attainable reach. Throughout her process, she often borrows from and reconstructs the ephemera of place, history, and memory, employing design, sculpture, and installation as primary mediums of operation. Rand Abdul Jabbar received a Master of Architecture from Columbia University in 2014 and also completed the Sheikh Al-Salama Emerging Artist Fellowship in 2017 as part of the 4th cohort. So I hope that gives you a good baseline for her practice, and she will also get into much more detail than I did. So with that, Rand, if you'd like to share your screen. If anyone is unmuted, can you please mute yourself? Thank you. Oh, wait. Okay, got it. Also, you can unmute yourself, Rand. Can you share your screen now?
Yes, it's working now. All right. All good? Firstly, thank you so much, Sarah, for inviting me to be part of your Artist Talk series. It's been also a great chance to sort of look back and reflect on some of the work from these past 4 years and really, try to think about that kind of journey. So the title of the talk is Excavating, Reconstructing, and kind of looking back, I've sort of been thinking about how these two verbs are in many ways kind of active agents in the kind of work that I've been doing, really kind of looking back, examining history, examining memory, but also kind of trying to reformulate it in many ways and trying to kind of create experiences that are rooted in the present, or kind of have an outlook that is not maybe focused towards the past, but really kind of trying to draw it in and make sense of it now. As Sarah mentioned, my background is in architecture. That's really kind of the foundation of my practice. But it very quickly kind of gravitated towards design and working at the scale of furniture and objects. I think this is a kind of, my first project kind of coming out of grad school, which was Forma. It was a commission as part of Tashkil's Tanween design program. And through that process, I was also kind of looking at heritage in many ways. It was inspired by traditional Dao building, but kind of trying to reformulate its ideas or its logic of kind of construction into a series of design objects. But I'm focusing on projects that are from 2016 to 2020, kind of starting with a project called Excavations. And so you see where that title kind of comes from. Because this for me was, a kind of pivotal moment in my practice. Excavations came out of an invitation by Design Week to co-curate the Iraq Pavilion at Abwab. This was 2016. So they asked myself and a good friend of mine, Hozan Zengana, who's an Iraqi Kurdish artist and designer based in Amsterdam, to kind of curate this pavilion. And we were sort of in this position where we're kind of tasked to, represent a place where on the one hand, you have this deep emotional affinity for, but on the other hand, you've been kind of displaced or detached from. I left Iraq when I was 5 years old. So there's this deep connection, but also a sense that you can't really kind of lay claim to an identity or lay claim to a contemporary Iraq that's not your own. But we found that kind of, Iraqi culture, despite its diversity, various ethnicities, languages, histories, what unites us really is this sort of common sense of pride in our ancient past. And it kind of made sense to look towards the land, the earth itself, and what archaeology has uncovered within it. So it became a project that responded to encounters with artifacts, sculpture, architecture, and script, kind of mining through museum archives and collections and responding to these encounters. And we positioned it as, something that we call the field of discoveries. Each object embodying some sort of nascent history, while collectively they're in dialogue as kind of fragments of our past or fragments of our culture. And it's set up in the language of form and color and shape, some sort of conversation between past and present. And this project really was this, I don't know, it gave me this kind of freedom to explore something that, really touched deep within me. And coming right out of this project, I was in the middle of Seif. And Seif was also one of those kind of pivotal experiences because it was a space to really explore outside the confines of open calls and exhibition commissions and things like that. It was really a space for you to kind of like sit back in the studio and think about what are your drivers, what are you really interested in, and creating work without necessarily knowing what the outcomes are going to be. And I spent the year kind of in a similar vein, interested in renegotiating the space between past and present, but contending with a more personal history. So drawing on experiences that have really shaped my conception of Iraq, the family archive, photo albums, which were kind of portals to a place that I didn't know or longed to know, the stories that I've inherited, and some early childhood memories that lay on a threshold between vivid and fabricated. And so the culmination of that was this presentation of reconstructions, which were a series of installations that kind of composed what I call a garden of follies. Each installation is almost a slice of experience. So maybe just to give you a little bit of background, like this is one of the photos from the album that really captured my imagination. It's a photograph of my grandparents at the farm, and they're surrounded by these palm trees, and what really drew me was this sort of outline of the shadow, my grandmother's shadow on my grandfather's shoulder, just how it spoke to the kind of intimacy of their relationship. And so I started kind of creating these set of drawings, these ink drawings, really kind of focusing on that. And at the same time, I was really interested in kind of exploring the relationship of my father to his mother. That the last 10 years of her life, they spent apart, and he's always kind of struggled with her loss. And I really wanted to create a work that was able to really kind of negotiate that. And so it culminated in this installation of the image, the photograph being projected onto a cast of his actual shoulder. So the shadow itself lies on his shoulder. So kind of taking a moment from the past and trying to recreate it or reconstruct it in the present, and how to kind of like bring them back together. Another work from that series is one called Gardenia. And it's a response to, I used to walk around for years getting this whiff of gardenia in the street and thinking like, oh, that reminds me of my grandfather's house in Baghdad. And really interrogating that memory, realizing that it's actually not mine, it's my mother's. It's me growing up and having her have that response every time she'd get that whiff. So it's almost like a memory that's inherited. And so I created a work that was almost this form or vessel, and within it was a scent dispenser with gardenia infused oil. So as the visitor kind of approached it, they would get a very intimate experience of that kind of whiff of gardenia. And there was this wonderful moment at the opening where a lady came by and kind of talked about how much that work resonated her, and I asked why, and she said, oh, it took me to Beirut. And so that kind of like that richness of an experience, although deeply personal, but can easily translate to a memory of another home in another place, that meant a lot to me. And so with these kind of this vein really starting to take shape within my practice, I made a decision in late 2018 to actually go back to Iraq for the very first time. It was for research, but it was also kind of for personal reasons, like feeling like, okay, this is clearly a kind of active agent, and I really wanted to experience it. And one of the most profound experiences there was a visit to the Iraq Museum, which is the kind of greatest repository of ancient Mesopotamian artifacts. So spent a lot of time there, actually with Iraqi archaeologist by the name of Yusuf al-Daham, who I'm going to talk about later, because he's also essential to another project of mine. And there was, school kids that day on a field trip, kind of taking notes and kind of experiencing that with them was also very special. So a lot of this content, this research, this experience really made its way into the upcoming project, which is Earthly Wonders, Celestial Beings, which is a project I started coming right back from Iraq. It's a continuation of a lot of the thinking of excavations, but this time working in a new medium, working with clay, which is a material that always attracted me, but also a material that is very much part of the material culture of Iraq. Iraq is a clay culture. We don't have a lot of stone. And so I really love this idea of kind of, working with your hands and creating the way in many ways, the same way, many of these objects that I'm looking to for inspiration are also created. It also, there's something special about ceramics for me personally, because, I grew up in a diaspora household where ceramics is a very important craft and art in Iraqi culture, and so our house is filled with it. Panels on the wall, objects on the tables. And when I was a kid, I remember kind of touching them and playing with them and kind of thinking about that place and projecting in my imagination what it might look like. This work was first shown at the NYU Abu Dhabi project space. These are some install shots. I think there were about 65 sculptures in total, primarily ceramics, but a few in different materials. And again, this idea of a kind of field, right? A more dispersed field this time, but also this kind of dialogue amongst these fragments. And you see some of the objects kind of repeating themselves from excavations, but they're primarily new forms. These are inspired by these eye gods that were found in the thousands, kind of all-seeing, all-knowing. And a lot of people kind of ask me about the compositions, and to be honest, a lot of those decisions were kind of made, on site. It was very intuitive. It was thinking about the forms that really spoke to one another, colors that kind of worked well with each other. And as part of that show, produced this catalog where I invited a very good friend of mine who's here on this call, Dima Al-Ghanem, who's a Kuwaiti architect, artist, poet, writer, jack of all trades. She's incredible, to write a series of responses and texts to the works. So we were actually working in separate ways. I really wanted her. I feel like Dima is someone who has an incredible reading of form, and I wanted her to kind of approach these objects as if stumbling upon them for the very first time. And so I would just send her photos of them, but never really talk to her about them. And these were very kind of, intuitive response. She grouped them into 6 groupings. And we'll talk a little bit about that later towards the end of the talk. This work was then presented at the Rabat Biennial in 2019. The show is called An Instant Before the World. So again, a very similar presentation. And then a kind of form of it through these photographs documenting the works was also presented as part of Nour Akaou's This Land's Unknown, which is an installation in Orleans, in France, as part of the architecture biennial there. So they traveled long distances, these babies, this summer. And so the last project I want to talk about is a research project that started also kind of late 2018. Was a big part of why I went to Iraq in the first place. It's a research project around a structure in Ana, which is a town in western Iraq. And the way it came up was basically, with all this research into kind of heritage and artifacts and thinking about, all the forces that are threatening them at the moment, I was curious to see what the damage was. And so I was doing kind of very general research into structures in Iraq that were destroyed by ISIS. And out of this, unfortunately very long list of names, one jumped at me, and it was the Minarat Ana. And Ana holds a special place for me because it's where my maternal grandfather is from. And so that was the sort of initial attraction. And I also knew the story of a town that was basically flooded in the 80s and its population relocated. So I was kind of curious. And what I thought was a very straightforward story actually came out to be an incredible story of this, structure that was built by the Uqaylid dynasty that had gone through multiple cycles of destruction and rebirth. The initial research really started with images like this. They're grainy images of the structure taken by Gertrude Bell, the British traveler, in 1909 during her travels through Iraq. She's also a figure that I'm kind of quite obsessed with. And just to give you a bit of context, Ana's right here. This is the border with Syria, and it lies directly on the Euphrates. This is a kind of close-up that shows the original settlement as being, is this an arch? Yeah. An island right in the middle of the Euphrates, and the minaret itself lies here, close to an excavated mosque. This is another photograph by Bell taken from atop the minaret itself, looking down at the Euphrates. And in her diary entry, she describes Ana as 3 hours long and 1 street wide. It has a very Babylonish look with its palms and its mud-built street filled with the sound of nawa'ir, which are these water wheels that you see sort of at the edge of the river, and the river washing its feet. And I knew, I kind of hinted at this story of multiple cycles of rebirth, but I'll get into the details a little later. But basically, there's very little information available online. And so through kind of friends of cousins in Baghdad, people eventually gave me the number of this man, Yusuf al-Daham, who become kind of essential to this whole project and this whole research. He's an Iraqi archaeologist from Ana. He worked for the Ana Museum and the Department of Antiquities. And this is us on that same visit to the Iraq Museum, standing next to a gypsum model of the minaret. And just to kind of describe its form very quickly, it's an octagonal structure, 8 sides, also 8 floors. And one of its defining features are these kind of carved niches that you see. Each floor has its own design. And that's what's very unique about the structure. I think there's only one other structure in Iraq that is quite similar to it, and that's how they were able to date it. The structure is significant in the history of kind of heritage development and management in the country, because it became the very first structure that was renovated by the Department of Antiquities in 1927, I believe. And you see here, you know, that it wasn't quite in bad shape, and Gertrude Bell's photographs also show that. And they're starting to kind of renovate and strengthen its base. And then these are kind of later photographs from the early 80s that show it in its kind of renovated state. And I wanted to give you also a glimpse of life in Ana. It's you know, quite iconic landmark. You see here people kind of hanging out next to it by the orchards, and you see the kind of lushness of the landscape around it. And then, as I mentioned, with Ana being kind of on the Euphrates, there was a decision made in the late 80s to construct a dam, and the consequences of which were the complete submersion of the city. And so they decided basically to construct a new city further inland and move everyone to kind of modern housing there. And the purpose of the dam was, you know, in many ways manage disputes with Turkey and Syria, but also is meant to, you know, generate electricity. It was meant to become a water reservoir, so on and so forth. And these are kind of stills from a video I found of Saddam Hussein inaugurating the dam in '87. And so the question became, you know, what do we do with this minaret? And there were several solutions put forth. One was basically just to leave it where it is and let it drown. Another one was, you know, over here to build a moat around it that would protect it from the flooding water. Another one was to kind of elevate it above sea level. And another kind of much more ambitious one was to actually slice the structure into 16 sections. Let me see if I can zoom here. And dismantle it and basically build a bridge from the island to the mainland, where these pieces would be transported to be, you know, reconstructed in the new site, in the new city. And that's what they did. So you see here again kind of grainy footage of the structure being sliced and dismantled on its way to the new city. And this is a photo from 2006 in its kind of reconstructed form in the new city. And it's quite ominous photo in March of '06 because 3 months later, basically there was a sniper stationed, an American sniper stationed at the very top. This is the highest point of the city. And it's said that Al-Qaeda bombed the structure to kind of as a form of retaliation against them. So, you know, all that was left of old Ana, the old city, this kind of iconic landmark of theirs, the sole survivor of the flooding, is now destroyed and kind of reduced to rubble. So a group of local archaeologists from Ana, from Anbar province, got together and kind of really put forth a plan to the Iraqi government and eventually secured funding to reconstruct the structure from the rubble. So you see them here kind of, you know, clearing it up, cleaning it up, and starting from all that was left is the base. You can kind of see it here behind them. And so they kind of started building beyond the base. And there's Yusuf here at the center. He really led that reconstruction effort. and championed that project. So as you can see, you know, the structure is kind of taking shape, and they've left these sort of gaps for the carved niches that existed beforehand. And they were able, basically based on very old drawings and detailed measurements that they have, to create a series of metal molds to the exact specifications that they use to kind of recast these carved niches onto the facade itself, using pretty much the same kind of materials that this structure was originally built out of, which is kind of lime and gypsum. And here it is in its finished form with all the carved niches, and it opened to kind of, you know, great fanfare. This was a brochure that they had published that kind of recounted the story and the history of the structure and the story of reconstruction. This is 2012 now, so 6 years after the initial destruction. And then in 2016, again, it was destroyed by ISIS this time. So we're back to where we started in many ways. These are very recent photographs of the site, maybe from, well, maybe about a year ago, let's say. So I was invited by Jameel Art Center in March of 2019 to present this research. I had just gotten back from Iraq a few months ago and was sort of overwhelmed by the amount of research that I had received from Yusuf, and it was an incredible opportunity to really sort through that. And so it was a kind of, you know, multimedia research installation of drawings, photographs, archival documents. There were some sound recordings from our conversations. There was a wall filled with photos from family albums for people of Ana that really showed life in the city before it was flooded. Because to me, it was really important, you know, for me, the structure represents not just the loss of a building, but really the loss of an entire way of life, loss of an ancient city in a way of living. And then also kind of, I've always been really interested by these carved niches, and so traced out, you know, based on those initial drawings, a one-to-one scale drawing of each of the carved niches to give people, you know, some sort of bodily relationship to the building. And so once this project concluded, we also invited Yusuf to come out to Dubai and have a discussion around the challenges that heritage preservation specialists face in areas of conflict. And you know, our Jameel was super supportive of the project, and we sort of started talking about, you know, how does this evolve to the next level, and where I saw the project going. And to me, those casts, let's see if we can go back, were key, because actually they were still available. Yusuf managed to store them and keep them, and they're the sole survivors of the reconstruction effort. And so we went about actually, well, Art Jameel basically commissioned me to recast these molds. Went back to Iraq, went to Ramadi this time, and basically worked with Yusuf on assembling a team of craftsmen that would work on recasting these molds to the same size, but kind of individually, as opposed to directly on the structure. And they eventually became part of an installation at the Phantom Limb exhibition at Jameel Art Center last October, titled "And the River Washing Its Feet," which was basically an installation of the 8 casts of the Minaret of Ana with video projections. And there were 2 videos, one which you see a kind of still of here, where a father, it's home video footage basically, and it's a father taking his kids to the edge of the river. This is right before the submersion of the city, and he looks over to the Qal'a Island where the minaret stands, kind of surrounded by scaffolding, and he tells his kids about the structure, explaining its importance, telling them that it's going to be moved, and kind of really recounting that history to the next generation. And the second film is a time lapse that shows the water levels rising as the river is, and Dana, the city, is flooded, until it's, you know, completely engulfed, and you see here just the kind of tops of the palm trees peeking out from above the water. So in many ways, the Euphrates, which was Ana's lifeline throughout its 4,000-year-old history, eventually becomes the perpetrator of its demise. Yeah, so that's what I have to share today.
Thank you so much, Rand, for taking us through some of your projects and sharing with us your process and progress throughout your practice. And just going back to your show, Earthly Wonders, Celestial Beings, that was actually the first time I got to see your work, and it was a great introduction to your practice at a beautifully curated show. And just going back to the collection of texts that Dima wrote to accompany the show, if you would like to introduce Dima, and we're going to have a few readings of them.
Yes, I'm super thrilled that Dima can be here with us today. And I've asked her if she wouldn't mind actually reading out some of the texts from her contribution to the exhibition. So Dima, if you want to unmute yourself, you can say hello to everybody.
Hi, hello.
So happy you can be with us today.
I really miss you. How are you doing?
Good. So Dima and I met actually, when was it? 2017? 18?
18.
Yes, we were both part of a program that the V&A and British Council were running for Gulf designers. And so it brought a great group of people together, and we're all very, very close friends. And it was really through that kind of interaction and very kind of intimate knowledge and understanding of each other's practices that I was, that I guess, yeah, fate brought us together. So what I want to do is basically share my screen, and I think Dima, you're going to read the entries in Arabic, and I'll just put the English on the screen as a translation for those.
Right.
Which one would you like to go to?
I'll start مع جهد أو جهد. قلب نابض بين الجهد والجهد، بين الوسع والغاية، أحيانا بالكاد يبلغ الاثنين، وأحيانا ينفد صبره ويبالغ. راحا تدور في الحقول تساوي الأرض وتواسيها، وعندما لجمت الأفواه وجفت الأهوار ظلت هناك عند ترافد النهرين تحاك البيوت من قصب وتعجن الأساطير من طين وماء. نزع بين نزعة الإنسان إلى الفعل وقدرته عليه هناك مجال ضبابي كثيف يغلف قدرتنا على الاختيار، وباندفاع القدرة وضمورها ينكمش ضفاف النهر ويتمدد، وتكون المدن أو لا تكون، تثأر أو تنتحر. ثم قال السياب: تعالي نذيب الزمان وساعة في عناق طويل. لا يحتكم مجال الذاكرة إلا للأمل، ولا يحفر الإلحاح إلا في قلب البعيد. من خير رأس يجري في تجاويف العقل دجلة، ينحت إمامة القلق وينبت الشوك من رؤوس الأنبياء، يغالب اللب باللبلاب ويطفئ هالة الحزن القديم، يهز القلق حاضرنا فنستنجد بالجذور وتورق جباهنا بالصور محض صور لوجوه تشبهنا ولكن لا نذكرها نعقلها أو نعقلها تاجا نحكم به الدنيا.
Thank you so much, Rand and Dima. I actually have a question for both of you. Dima, how was it navigating these objects that were being sent to you, and how did you categorize them, and how did you respond to them through words? And similarly, Rand, how was it in comparison to the way that you grouped them in the show? I know you mentioned that it was, but I'd love to hear more about that.
I can start. Yeah. So Rand, she called me and talked to me about this group, and actually at first she sent them to me before burning, so I didn't even see the colors. And I remember that I was like very much overwhelmed by the different shapes and the different forms, and I started asking her about her inspirations. Where did she what are, like, for example, her experience in the museums? What did she see, and what was the source of her inspiration for these groups? And she showed me the tools that she was inspired from. And from that, I started to see like a pattern for her perception to the objects in the museum. And I saw things that are more related to tools that you grab in your hand, things that are more related to labor, and those collection of that collection of pieces that really look like people peeking into your soul. So I kind of really basically divided them based on the nature of the museum pieces she was inspired from, but also how they also represent when you see them by their basically mere form, and what they have and what they kind of let you feel when you see them. Just like, for example, in one of the pieces, Qabada, you can see that the grip is very, or the grasp is very present in the form that Rand was forming to represent those things that she've seen in the museum.
Show everyone that work that Dima is referring to. This is the grasp.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. And also, it's really interesting because when I had a conversation with Rand prior to this talk, we were talking about how these objects kind of transcend time and transcend borders and transcend spaces. So it's very interesting to see how different people interpret it, especially even just interpreting the objects through photos versus experiencing it in person. So I think that's really beautiful. And Rand, would love to also speak about that. Or Dima, if you had something else to say.
I have something to add. Actually, that kind of encounter and these conversations that we had, me and Rand, made me also understand her own, like, be part of her own experience when she went for the first time to Iraq. This was very much, that was the strongest kind of drive for me to write, because this kind of feeling of being completely detached from what is considered a homeland, and then going back to it is very to me is very strong, because I personally never left for a long time from my homeland. I actually almost lived my whole life in one room in my basically the place I grew up with. So this idea of displacement is I never experienced it before, and therefore it was very interesting for me to experience with Rand in this kind of collaboration.
Thank you for sharing that, and also your readings were very beautiful. So thank you for and to invite her to yeah, speak about the text as well. So,
yeah. Yeah, you asked me a question about you know, what I thought about the groupings and everything, and I mean, for me, honestly, like, and you can ask Dima, like, I got very, I was very little involved in her writing process, like, and I was very clear about that. You know, I was just like, I trust your reading and your response, because I had there was really an experience that we shared, which basically goes back to that DNA workshop. There was a day where I presented my work, including the Reconstructions project and the Gardenia project. And later that night, Dima just kind of out of the blue came over to me and just talked to me about how she read that form. And that's when I knew, okay, she's a witch, you know, like this woman sees things in a way like no one else can. And she talked to me about, you know, it was something along the lines of it being almost like a womb-like structure, and also about this idea of, you know, the way it's kind of set up on the wall, the way it's attached to a wall. She said it's almost like you're grabbing the wall and pulling it towards you, trying to make it your own. And in many ways, like, you know, that really like touched me and really moved me, because I always felt like I was like trying to build ground for myself. I was trying to build territory for myself, to engage a place that I didn't really feel like, you know, that was fully my own. So it's almost like you had to build that territory. And so it was really because of that kind of, that experience that we shared, that, you know, I felt like, you know, this is the perfect opportunity to really be able to work on something together. And I was so moved and so touched by her responses. I started to see things differently myself, you know, the way she kind of sorted them out, these kind of repetitive forms, and also this sort of there was a relationship to the body, you know, the head, the grasp, the brain cavities, like, you know, things that I never really kind of saw or thought about before. So that was wonderful.
I always wished to kind of write descriptions for an imaginary museum, and you gave me that opportunity, to be honest. I really kind of imagined what could be the descriptions that under, you know, those little descriptions with historical events, and what if they're something else? You know? But yeah, I remember you were trying to remind me of that conversation in the park at the V&A, and now when you explained it, I just now remembered that conversation, and yeah, that's true.
I think it was a great accompanied text to the show, along with like what you wrote as well for the curatorial statement. And talking about bodies, and it kind of takes me to scale. And I find within your work that the window sills were to scale. And I was wondering, with the objects in that specific show, you were inspired by certain artifacts, but were you also trying to mimic the scale and size of them? Was that important to the production of the work?
No. You know, there were things that were, you know, little details of a tiny seal that were blown up to kind of, you know, yeah, body size object, and it was the other way around. It could be architecture that kind of comes down, and that, because and I like that, the way, you know, scale also, or forms, kind of repeat or reverberate across those scales. There's a kind of fluidity there. A lot of the making was really kind of like in some of them there were sketches or ideas, you know, kind of looking at something, sketching out how you imagine it to be, and then starting. But there were often times where I would just sort of start and it would kind of take a direction of its own. And that was something, I mean, that was another thing that I loved when it came to the materiality of the work, which is working with clay. You know, I, again, kind of trained as an architect. A lot of my work was, you know, obviously a scale that I would create, you know, models of things and not the things. And, you know, working in design was a great way to kind of shift to that, you know, more human scale, but I wasn't producing the pieces. I was, a lot of the times I was using kind of digital design tools and fabrication tools. But with this work, I was really I kind of promised myself that I really wanted to use my hands and use also, you know, the expression or the knowledge or the wisdom of your hands to kind of translate that into the work as well. So it was really my first chance to really make the things I conceive of.
And also you mentioned this idea of field of discoveries, and it just prompts me to think of like discovery as a term. Do you use it quite commonly in your work? And what are like the different discoveries that you've discovered? And maybe what does that term in your definition mean?
Yeah, I think, I mean, discovery is definitely a term and an agent in my work because it's primarily a research-based practice, and it's research that's fueled by curiosities. It starts with a question of like, oh, I wonder what ISIS destroyed in Iraq, you know, and then kind of takes, you know, you discover this thing and it takes a world of its own, and or it's like flipping through an album of photographs and discovering this little detail in a photo that really grasps your imagination. So I guess that's kind of my relationship to that. And so when I speak about the field of discoveries and excavations, it's because, you know, these were, you know, you sift through hundreds or thousands of kind of photographs and archives and museum collections. And one thing just kind of like, I don't know, like almost takes your breath away and you respond to it. And that's what those objects were in many ways. You know, it was in no way a comprehensive history, a comprehensive look. It wasn't also kind of a very, you know, structured analysis of historic objects. It was emotional encounters. So that's what those kind of were.
Also, like these discoveries and like variations, specifically with the project of Minat of Ana, like it was at first you discovered this and then you presented it as a research-based project, if I may say, and then also taking it to a more sculptural or even like 4D, I would say, like with the overlay of the installation of the video over the sculptures. And I'm wondering, is this something, or this project, is it something that you would like to continue to explore? And if you could give us like a little bit of insight on how like you would like to push it further.
Yeah, I always finding myself like hesitating putting an end date to projects and always like having an urge to put ongoing. Because in many ways I feel like, you know, it's never really complete. And Ana is definitely one of those. Like you know, from the moment Yusuf told me about those molds and their availability, I had kind of that imagination of being able to kind of realize them. And a lot of that came from kind of like thinking about, you know, copy and original and forms of reconstruction and so that being able to realize those casts was already kind of, you know, a dream that I didn't really think would materialize within such a short time frame. But then there's still so much. I mean, the research was presented in a very, I mean, in many ways it was an exercise for me, a mental exercise, putting that installation up, because it was a chance for me to sort through all the content that I have and try to, you know, make sense of it and present it. But I think, you know, the next phase for me would really like to kind of put that into some sort of document format or book format, and really bring all this research content together in a coherent manner to be able to tell the let's say, classical history or classical historic narrative of it. But then there's another aspect that I'm really interested in, which is a kind of oral narrative. And I started with that, kind of collecting, small interviews with residents of Ana, talking about their city, the memory, talking about the structure, what it means for them. And so that's something that, would require a much larger investment of time to be there and build these relationships, and kind of like, whether it comes out in the form of a film or some other medium, I'm not sure, but that's definitely something I'd like to explore. So kind of looking at parallels of the history of the structure, but also the stories of its people and their memories.
And did you find yourself discovering something new with every variation of the project?
Yeah, I mean, the very first iteration, let's say Library Circles, was literally all about discovery, because I had just come back. He dumped on me, like, I don't know, gigabytes of content that I still hadn't even managed to sort through. So the entire process of actually putting that exhibition up was discovering the content that I had, but then also discovering gaps and looking for that. For example, I realized, like, okay, there's no documentation of this dam, and like sifting through videos and archives and websites, and then I eventually finding that video of Saddam inaugurating the dam, finding these home videos, and then, the places that they were visiting or the songs they were singing, and kind of going back to Yusuf and asking about that. And so there was constantly this sort of this back and forth process. And then with making the cast, it was actually kind of handling them directly, understanding their fragility, working with, and also kind of negotiating, with the craftsmen that were there, and really trying to explain to them, why are you even doing this? What does this even mean? I also discovered a lot about the logistics of trying to get something out of Iraq and bring it here. I hugged them, didn't want to leave them the night they arrived. They were still cold from being cast. So yeah, and we're hoping to produce another set of casts that would actually remain for the Yana Museum. So almost some sort of like record or artifact of the original structure.
Yeah, those are very exciting next steps, and I can't wait to see you realize them as well. So if anyone also has questions of your own, you can unmute yourself at any time. We're gonna be here till 8, and if the conversation continues, we'll be here for like 5 or 10 minutes after 8 as well. So feel free to do that at any time. And a question that I had as well is, with your like body of work, I think I mentioned this before, it surpasses these like borders, we may call them, and this time. And do you think that it also hints to like the unknown or the beyond? Because it's also like this futuristic feel. I keep going back to that same show because I actually got to experience it. But is that something that you've heard before or thought about? Yeah, if you could talk a little about that.
Yeah, I like this. I feel like I'm always trying to like defy time, in the sense that kind of not let it take hold of the work. And so even in its formal expression, like that comment about like, and I feel that way with many ancient things. I think maybe because it's like, I hate to use the word primitive, but I think maybe more natural form of expression, right? These are how early humans thought to shape things, because it was so intuitive. It was like not really shaped by 4,000 years or 5,000 years of culture and knowledge that we now are kind of surrounded by. And so in many ways, yeah, they kind of lie on that weird space between like, is it ancient or is it futuristic? But yeah, I don't know, that's a language that really kind of speaks to me. A lot of my favorite sculptors I think, employ similar strategies, like someone like Mona Saudi, who also talks about kind of walking through the ruins near her house, and how her relationship to stone, and how these forms emerge. You think about like Noguchi, and how he feels like a piece of stone actually speaks to him and tells him how to kind of form it. Henry Moore. So you see there's a kind of similar vein in the type of kind of formal language that I like. Also, my cousin, Hala, who's on this call, is studying to become an astrologist. And she told me today that there's something I have in the 12th house, which means that I'm ancient. So I'm very happy about this new piece of knowledge that I have. So maybe it's a language that I've spoken for a while.
We have a question. I think we'll end on this. We spoke about possibly future projects, but Rand Abdullah is asking, what are you working on currently, or what are you thinking about currently, and what are you doing at the moment?
Actually, I'm really excited because right now I am developing this project. It's in very kind of early phases, but it's basically a project that's being commissioned by the Shubbak Festival in London, and it's to work with Iraqi diaspora in London through a series of workshops. It's primarily going to be actually with Iraqi women immigrants or first or second generation diaspora. And what we're doing is basically a series of exercises that look at kind of, that relationship or between the tangible and the ephemeral. So looking at kind of objects in their homes that they either brought with them or that they inherited, and looking at really the emotional meaning or value that's, present within these objects. And starting to really unpack that, thinking about kind of network of associations, memories, photographs where they appeared, and maybe creating a series of texts that really interrogate how, a lot of our memories, a lot of our histories are kind of embedded within these objects that we sort of live with. So it's again, kind of in a very early kind of research phase, and I'm very curious to see how, what the kind of collective experience is going to be as well, and what I'm going to learn from these women. But it's really a chance to have a conversation that, means a lot to me. And as I mentioned, kind of when I was talking about earthly wonders, kind of being surrounded by these ceramic objects and these rugs and these kind of silver objects from Iraq almost served like portals for me. Mm-hmm. And so I'm really curious to see how that relationship translates, and curious to see, what kind of will come out of it. So that's my current preoccupation.
All right, thank you so much for sharing that with us. And on that note, I just want to say thank you everyone for joining us today on this session. And thank you, a special thank you to Rand for agreeing to do this and be a part of this series. It was a great time speaking to you and learning more about your practice. And I hope everyone also enjoyed that as well. So we're gonna end it here. And inshallah, we'll see you on July 13th with the next artist. So thank you so much.